To many train crews, other than safety, being on time is crucial. Being late means lost paths and with it lost revenue. Sometimes it's not preventable. But what many people don't know, arriving early can be just as bad, and many crews who arrive at their terminus early will inevitably have that chat with their superiors, or as many who work the metals call it, the tea and biscuits. Although a large proportion of the railway network was laid in and around the 1840s to 60s, moving around the country wasn't as easy as many people thought. For starters, there were hundreds of companies, and while local routes were rarely a problem, many would have to buy multiple tickets, one for each company, for longer journeys. Luckily, the Railway Clearing House started to solve the problem. In a broad nutshell, the customer would only have to pay a single fare, and the fare would be separated into the companies by the Railway Clearing House. It took time, but by 1850, over 55% of companies had enrolled. Not only did it make travel easier, but in some cases more affordable, as the cheapest ticket was optimised. The two main arteries from London to Scotland was the East and the West Coast mainline, and four companies were in charge. The North East Railway and the Great Northern took care of the East from King's Cross, while the LNWR and the Caledonian Railways took care of the West at Euston, with both meeting at Princes Street Station in Edinburgh. The territory stopped and started at York and Carlisle respectively, where either the Scottish or English railways would take over. Luckily for passengers, carriages were not as territorial as the locomotives, and although there was a longer stop in these cities while the locos were changed, the passengers didn't have to. Being on opposite sides of the Yorkshire Dales did not, however, quell their rivalry. The companies were bitter towards each other and would compete for passengers. For the passengers, it wasn't about loyalty, it was about speed. The East Coast would gain the upper hand on passenger traffic, and its grip on passenger numbers would only strengthen when they announced provisions for third-class passengers would be provided. With more people having disposable income, it cornered a market. It was a no-frills service in shared compartments, but it was a popular move. The railways on the West Coast had to act. In June 1888, at the latest possible hour, the Scotch Express, their premier named train, would now be arriving a full hour before the East Coast train, the Scotch Flyer. Less than a month later, the East Coast boasted its flyer would arrive half an hour quicker, reducing between stops, especially the one in York. A bit of a problem for customers, as that half-hour stop was a chance for many to get some food or spend a penny. It only took a week for the West Coast to match this time. However, the very day that they started this service, the crew was shocked to see the Scotch Flyer sat in Edinburgh Station, having arrived at 6 p.m. This wouldn't do, and when the West Coast bosses heard of the news, they went back to the drawing board. A non-stop run was simply not feasible. Not only would the Caledonian not allow it, the crews and the engine needed the rest. The locomotive needed to be refueled, and the crew could only do a few hours at best. Non-important stops had already been axed, and they could only push the stopping time so much. That was when they hatched a plan: split the train. Instead of one train, they decided to run two. One would be a direct run from Euston to Crewe, no stops and no breaks, while the other would follow. It would be just as fast in speed, however it would call at the station the first train missed. Meanwhile at Crewe, the Caledonian locomotive would be ready to take the train the rest of the way. On the 6th of August, news of the service had gotten out, and crowds of people lined Euston Station's platform to watch the new train. Even the press and the bookies were there, taking bets on the fastest time. The locomotive chosen was, to the bookies, a bit of a surprise. It was a 25-year-old Ramsbottom single, however the Caledonian ran a brand new engine number 123. As the train set off, the directors could only watch and hope that this plan would finally see off the East Coast for good. They would only know the answer when the results came back through on the cables. The East Coast could only respond the way they could, by cutting further stoppage time. This stretched the arrival time to 5:45. They attempted this on the 13th of August, however the West Coast got wind of this and in a true revenge plot threw out the predicted timetable and told the crew to gun it when they were ready, thus arriving in Princess Street in time to greet the West Coast crew with a cheery wave and a cup of tea. Both sides met the next day. Although some passengers had benefited from the impromptu racing, the majority hadn't. Many had missed trains as they went too early, while others used to the half-hour stops would step out only to find their trains have gone without them. There were also so many close shaves with people opening doors even before the train had stopped, or tried to open doors while the train was pulling out of the station. The stack of complaints was stacking up, and there was a real risk of serious harm. It was decided that both lines would adhere to a timetable of 7¼ hours for the East Coast and 8 hours for the West. This, coupled with new lines and more curves and gradients, made racing more dangerous. Things simmered for a while, but in 1893 the West Coast changed its timings and devised a very naughty scheme. The only times the two railways would ever converge would be at Kinniber Junction. This was on the recent stretch from Edinburgh to Aberdeen. The signal box before this on the West Coast was called Dunton, with the Caledonian controlling both boxes. It's important to note that the travel time between these boxes was about 2 minutes when travelling at the permitted speeds. But at Dunton, the booked time, the official time that the Caledonian stated it should take, was changed to 6 minutes. Because signallers have to use the book time, the Dunton signaller had to offer the train to the Kinniber box, even though it wasn't there. The Kinniber box had no choice but to accept it, leaving the North British Railway, the railway tasked with the Aberdeen stretch, sat behind a red signal, getting later and later. This started a whole new competition. Who can get to Dunton, or the East Coast box of Montrose first, would be the first to get to Aberdeen. Rather than day expresses, the race would focus on the night. The East Coast adjusted its timetable and pressure was put on the staff at the new Waverley station to change engines quickly. It was a race to Kinniber, and it would rapidly fall down the chain, affecting the trains to Edinburgh. The NER breached the agreement made years earlier by reaching Edinburgh early. West Coast responded with an overnight run, arriving at 7 a.m, but beating it by almost 40 minutes. On the 18th of August, some journalists were invited on the NER train to Aberdeen, with assurances they're going to win. They tore up the countryside, screaming through sleeping towns, at one point reaching speeds of 81 miles an hour. When they arrived at Aberdeen at 5:30 a.m, they claimed to have done it. Except when they glanced over to the other platform, they were stunned. There, sitting bold as brass, was the Caledonian, having arrived 15 minutes prior. Again, the old crowds crept back to the stations and along the route, cheering the Titans on. Although the passengers were getting jostled, the people and the press loved it. But in 1896, the racing came to a sudden and tragic halt. There was a dangerous curve near Preston, and the seasoned West Coast drivers always took care on that stretch and slowed down. But in July, the drivers of the double-headed overnight express had not had the luxury of experience. The train passed over too fast, derailing it and killing a passenger. Public perception on the racing changed overnight, and cheers turned to fear and then anger. The train companies once again made an agreement, and this time they knew, for the passengers, they would need to keep it. But in 1923, 130 companies became 4. One looked after the West and one the South. But the remaining 2 would take charge of the East Line and the West Line, and once again rivalries would flare. And from it, the age of steam would never look or be the same again.